Hello everyone, welcome to Horror Stories. Story 1. To give some background information, this event occurred a little over a year ago, and I still haven't been able to even begin to get over it. I'm a 22-year-old 5'4" female, and at the time I was 21. My family and I had recently moved to a new town that was a fair amount more rural than the town I had previously lived in, and our new house was a large ranch-style house with a basement. I was home from college, and my parents had left for the week to celebrate their wedding anniversary with their friends who lived several hours away. Before I continue, I'll give you a quick layout of the house so that you'll be able to imagine the setting. There were 3 doors which led into the house, one on the front porch, a sliding glass door on the back porch, and another door on the other side of the wall from my bedroom which led into the garage and the basement. When you walk out of my bedroom and turn, you can see all the way across the house, kitchen, living room, dining area, to the door of my parents' bedroom, and the stairs leading up from the basement. It had been a few days since my parents left, and I hadn't had any problems. They had sent me a couple messages on Facebook letting me know that they arrived to their friend's house safely and were having a good time. The day had gone well, and I was sure to check that I had locked all the doors of the house once the sun started to go down. It was about 11 p.m., and I was doing my nightly routine of laying in bed and messing around on the computer when I suddenly got this sinking feeling of dread. I felt as if I was being watched. It was summer, and we didn't have air conditioning, so I had a large box fan in the window blowing the cool night air into my stiflingly hot room. But once that feeling settled over me, I decided that I should remove the fan and close the window just in case. Once removing the fan, shutting and locking the window, and pulling down the curtain, I felt a bit better. However, I still couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I lay back in bed and tried to continue what I was doing, though I didn't put my headphones back on. After a few minutes, I began to hear something that sounded like light scratching. I sat still in bed, listening to the sound, trying to pinpoint what it was and if I recognized it at all. Our new house, although relatively close in distance to our neighbors, had a fair amount of around it, so I thought the scratching may have been an animal or someone's dog that got loose and wanted to come inside. After a few minutes, the scratching stopped, and everything returned to silence. I figured that I was probably right and that it must have been an animal. My relief was short-lived, as soon after the scratching stopped from the other side of the wall, I began to hear slow footsteps descending into the basement. This is when I realized that there was someone in my house. There was no way I could get out of the house without walking past the basement stairs. We didn't have a house phone, and at the time, I was in the process of getting a new cell phone because mine was broken beyond repair. I sat there for a few seconds wondering what the hell I should do. I knew that I would need to get out of the house as soon as possible, and that the more time I wasted, the worse it could be for me. I contemplated popping the screen out of my bedroom window and jumping out, but it was far enough off the ground that there was a good chance I would end up getting hurt if I did, not to mention that if I jumped out the window and hurt myself, I wouldn't be able to run for help, and I would be right next to the door that whoever was in my house had gone through. So I decided to very carefully and quietly open my door and peek out around the corner, and if the coast was clear, I would make a dash for the front door and sprint to my neighbor's house. I very slowly opened my bedroom door, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness of the house before creeping around the corner and looking to see if it was safe to make a run for it. What I saw nearly made me vomit. As my eyes scanned the house, I noticed that something was off. I squinted hard as I looked over at the basement stairs and was able to make out the shape of a man. What made it worse? He wasn't just standing at the top of the stairs. He was crawling up them like some kind of nightmare creature. I quickly backed into my room again, shutting and locking the door as quietly as I could. I didn't think that he had seen me, but there was no way that I was going to make a run for it now. My only choice was to pop the screen and jump out the window. As I was unlocking and opening my window, I heard the handle to my bedroom door turn. Once the man realized that it was locked, in a sickeningly sweet, sing-song voice, he cooed, "I know you're in there." This was followed by a loud cackle, and what I can only imagine was him throwing himself at full force against my door. I ripped the screen out from the window and flung myself out. I landed wrong on my right foot and I was sure that I had broken my ankle. But at the time I couldn't think of anything other than getting as far away as possible. I got up and ran as fast as I could to my neighbor's house, knocking on their door in a panicked frenzy and ringing the bell over and over. I looked over at my house as I was yelling for my neighbors to let me in, and I swear, I could see the man standing at my window, waving at me. My neighbors finally opened the door after what felt like forever, and I managed to explain well enough what was going on for them to let me in and call the police. I stayed with them until the police arrived. The police searched my house and found that the lock to the basement had been picked and that door to my bedroom was hanging off its hinges. They weren't able to find the man anywhere, and because I had only seen him for a split second in the dark, I couldn't provide them with a good description. Of course, I got into contact with my parents immediately and they hurried home. The police took my statement and searched the area for the man, but of course they came up with nothing. After this event, my parents and I were sure to add deadbolt locks to the door leading into the basement and the door leading out of the basement to the rest of the house. They also helped me pay to get a new phone. What really bothers me about all of this is that nothing was stolen. There wasn't even any evidence that the guy had looked through anything while he was in my house. Story 2. I used to take care of a mentally disabled man in a community protection program. He had to be kept away from people because of his sudden violent outbursts. His parents were rich and bought an old farmhouse on 10 acres or so, about 4 miles out of town, so that he could be away from the public and not forced into a psych ward. For 4 years, I worked there on a 56-hour shift, come in on Sunday evening and leave Wednesday afternoon. There were 2 of us on these shifts, and we were both supposed to be there the entire 56 hours. But because we were the most senior trainers on staff, we would take turns going home on one of the 2 nights we were scheduled. After 3 years of being in that house, I had become comfortable with it. Despite it being so isolated and overall kind of creepy, I would always stay up and watch TV until around midnight. My client was always locked in his room at about 8 p.m. One night, about 12:15 am, I turned the TV off and pulled the covers over myself to try and get some sleep. There was one window in the staff room and it faced the back of the property, and it was about 6 feet off the ground. I had just started drifting to sleep when I heard the most blood-curdling woman scream from right outside the window. I popped up so fast that I nearly lost consciousness and had to steady myself in the doorway while the scream continued and then faded away. I grabbed a flashlight from the laundry room and threw open the back door, illuminating the area outside the window, and there was nothing. I ran along the perimeter of the house and saw nothing. I watched the sun come up the next morning, desperately glued to the TV, trying to distract myself from what had happened. All of the people I worked with were much older than me, And there was no good reason to play a prank like that in the middle of January, in Eastern Oregon. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it bothers me to this day. But instead of him turning around and going back towards my house, he veered off and started heading to the town I knew that he lived in. I should mention that it was pitch black out, and the town where John lived was surrounded by dense woods. This isn't even worth mentioning if you take the highway and proper turnoffs to get there. But he decided he wanted to go via the back roads because it's more scenic, despite the fact that couldn't see a thing. John had gone from being incredibly talkative to almost completely silent. He kept driving further into the wooded area. A few times I'd asked him questions about himself to break the awkward silence. At one point, I put my hand on his knee affectionately, trying to regain the friendly, flirty banter that we had had before. He blanked me for the most part, occasionally answering in soft grunts or nods. It was like he was having a tantrum. John pulled into the parking lot for the forest. It was around 9 p.m., so naturally it was totally empty. He slowly kept driving, looking around for other cars, and then parked the car upright at the end, close to the woods. There was nobody else in the parking lot, and I hadn't even seen us pass other cars to get there. For 10 minutes, he just sat there, staring into the darkness ahead, which was disturbing. I think I managed to make small talk for maybe 5 minutes, which is a long time when someone isn't talking back. Then I joined him in his silence. I was afraid of appearing fake. I didn't want him to think I was scared. So some time of silence goes past, and abruptly John gets out of the car, closes the door, and locks the car. I was stuck inside. His lights were on so I could sort of see ahead. In front of the car was a field that maybe went on for about 20 feet, and then beyond that were trees and dense forest. To the left was the rest of the car park, and the exit at the far end, and to the immediate right was more forest with a small path. John disappeared into the forest ahead. I tried the handle on the door. It would not open. I began to rationalize this. Maybe he'd accidentally locked the door. I was telling myself if he really wanted to do something, he would have stayed in the car. With no sight of John, I decided I needed to call someone. I looked around for my phone, and I couldn't find it. This was an old, silvery pay-as-you-go flip phone. I was confused that I couldn't find it because I had put it right next to me in the cup holder. After looking for it for a good few minutes, I became sure that he had taken it. Mind you, I didn't want to start rooting around his car, knowing he might be watching me. I didn't want him to catch on that I was freaking out. At that point, I started looking for my phone with only my eyes, instead of making it obvious. I was petrified this guy was watching me panic in the darkness. My eyes were darting all around the floor. Nothing. I looked up and squinted into the field and forest ahead. I saw him. John was standing about 10 feet from the car, in that small field. He was standing and smiling. It was the friendly smile. He looked terrifying. This was not the same guy that I got in the car with. I looked ahead and smiled back. I was still trying to act like his behavior was normal. Like nothing he was doing was scary. Still smiling, his tongue began to protrude from his mouth. He stuck it out all the way. He began wagging his tongue up and down while maintaining eye contact with me. I felt myself trembling. I was trying to compose myself. Not taking his eyes off of me, and with his tongue still out, he started unzipping his pants, and then began to urinate in front of me, while staring at me the whole time. This is the point I found it difficult to act like I was in on his behavior. I looked down at the floor, not wanting to watch what was in front of me. He didn't creep or slink back to the car. Instead, I hear his thundering steps, and then a slam against the window. I guess at this point I was the luckiest person alive, because another car pulled into the parking lot. I don't know what this did to John, but immediately he got back into the car and laughed at me, that normal laugh, and said, "So what music do you like? I'll put it on while I drive you home." And he did. He drove me all the way home. When he pulled up to my house, I went for the door, but it was still locked. "I want you to promise me something." I asked him what that was. If you ever see me after this, turn the other way. Act like you don't know me. If you see me with my family, don't you dare say a word. I don't expect to bump into you, but don't say anything." I agreed, and then I asked him, "Have you seen my phone?" He told me no. I guess my phone was a small sacrifice for surprisingly making it home okay. When I got inside my house, I said goodnight to my parents, and went upstairs to my room, and then turned on my computer. I wanted to gather as much information about the guy that I could. Back then, I used MSN Messenger, like AOL Instant Messenger. It logged in automatically whenever I started up my PC. Now, before I get to the final part of this story, it's important that you know this. One day before, I had been at my best friend's house. We had the kind of friendship where it was like, who could pick on the other the most. It was all good fun, and we mostly just made fun of each other and had a laugh. The day before, my friend had changed 2 contacts in my phone. She replaced the contact mom with a guy that I had been texting back and forth with. I immediately knew she had done this because I saw the previous messages come up, but I didn't change the numbers back at the time, thinking that I would just do it later. So when I logged on to MSN Messenger, I had a ton of messages from this guy and a few from my best friend. When John had locked me in the car, he had taken my phone and texted mom, which was actually this guy. "I'm sorry, but I decided to move out. I've met someone. Please don't look for me. I am happy being left alone." The guy knew that this was a big red flag. He responded and texted my phone back saying, "I don't think this is you. I know where you went and I'm calling the police." This was incredibly quick thinking for him, as he had absolutely no idea where I was. I think that text saved my life that night, and it explains John's sudden change of behavior. If it was the random car that pulled into the parking lot, it was that text. Story 4. I was staying at a friend's house and woke up in the middle of the night to someone else in bed with us. I could see from the street lamp that my friend was turned away from me when I sat up, and that there was an unknown person there too. It was very dark and I couldn't make out their facial features, so I really gently reached out and touched them. They appeared to be asleep, but for all I know, they were awake with wide eyes looking at me. I can't explain why I didn't scream or anything. I decided to lay down and not move, and if they did something that could have meant trouble, then I would react. I didn't sleep and watched as this person eventually got up and walked out of the room, down the stairs and out the front door. I went downstairs to make sure they had really left and then locked the door. It really freaked me out that someone could welcome themselves into a home and just climb into bed with 2 girls. My friend slept through it all and doesn't truly believe that it happened. Story 5. When I was a kid, barely a teenager, I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the eldest of three, I assumed this responsibility with no pay or thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because my parents needed it. They had had marriage problems in the past, and their counselor told them they should go on a weekly date. You know, revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. It's up to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in a long time, and they both seemed genuinely excited for a date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stick together. And so it was on that night of December 3rd in the year 2006. I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway, wrapping my arms around my torso in response to the wintry mountain air. I entertained myself for a few brief moments by exhaling forcefully and watching my breath float away into nothing. And there was truly nothing around me, not a car or a creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, nose tingling from the chill. George and Kate were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help feeling like an only child. George, who was 3 years younger than me, was severely autistic and about as talkative as a bag of bricks. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words. Milk and sandwich was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Kate, meanwhile, was still a baby, just shy of 2 years old. The 9-year gap between them is glaring, but to this day, my parents swear to me that Kate wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school, when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner, and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. George in his room with the PlayStation 2 and Kate in her crib in front of Sesame Street. Myself, I ignited the basement fireplace, dimmed the overhead lights, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. I read in perfect contentment for nearly an hour. Night had fallen by then, and the room had become toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard George's heavy footsteps descending the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, his eyes looking at me in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" George stared at me blankly. "George," I said, more clearly this time. "Did someone knock on the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window. Knocking on window." I stood up, now wide awake. "George, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a trick on me, I thought, but being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought. But what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told George, hand trembling slightly. I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's bedroom. "Kate," I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief. But still, my heart pounded in my chest. I made my way down the hall to George's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder outside to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from the video game paused screen. I listened for a moment, but heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal nothing. Just a landscape of freshly fallen snow, backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night, relieved, as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing an individual fractal all the way to the footprints just beneath the window's frame. At first, I did not comprehend them. I just stared, transfixed, at the deep imprints in the snow. Shoes. A man's shoes. None of my friends wore that size. Of that I felt sure. I traced them backwards from the window to the sidewalk, from whence this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone proudly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard, but once they passed behind the giant pine tree, they disappeared. My heart leapt to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree was still there. In panic, I quickly backed away from the window. Georgie sensed my fear and began to whimper. No, 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 SHH, I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off and led Georgie out of the room. I quickly pulled Kate from her crib, powered her TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs into the blackness. "Can't see," George said, and Kate began to cry. I shushed her hurriedly as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat George down on the couch and settled Kate into his arms. "Sit right here," I directed, staring into his eyes. "Don't move, do you understand? Do not move." I thought to myself, I need to call the police. I would have called my parents, but this was 10 years ago and they didn't have cell phones. So I took the stairs quickly and quietly, tiptoeing to the phone hanging from the wall of our living room. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. Silence. I slammed it on the receiver and picked it up again. Again. Nothing. I think it was around this point that I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I was scared. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that the storm had killed the phone line. But there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there wasn't even a breeze. Certainly nothing that could have disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked into Kate's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was towards the tree, of course, where the footprints stopped, but now they continued. Sometime while I was herding my siblings downstairs, whoever was behind the tree had moved. I followed the footsteps across my frozen front yard to a man standing near the driveway. He was looking right at me. My breath stopped. I was frozen in place. This was not one of my friends. I had never seen this man before, but he was looking at me with an eerie blankness. He was wearing a black turtleneck and black slacks, a lone dark spot on a blanket of purest white as he stood in the snow. My eyes never left him and his never left me. We stood still, silently staring for what seemed like an eternity. My heart throbbed in my chest and I felt nauseous. For the first time, gazing into this man's eyes from afar, I began to consider the possibility of my death. I thought of my dad's brother who was killed in an accident at age 11, forever 11, never growing up, frozen in time in the memories of all who knew him as a soul of eternal youth. At this, the tears flowed freely once more. "Please don't hurt us," I begged in a sobbing whisper. I knew he could not hear me, but I could not help myself. Finally, he broke eye contact with me and looked toward the heavens, toward the gently falling snow. He was saying something, but what? I could not hear. I stared transfixed as he pulled a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Then, still gazing upward, still muttering to himself, he flung whatever it was to his feet. I desperately wanted to run to get my siblings, but I thought that to let this man out of my sight would be unconscionably foolish. No, better to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring skyward, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. It was a knife. A long, callous blade, which he had removed from his other pocket. It bore dark stains already. From what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale, distended stomach. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell ungracefully upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils, but he looked happy, beyond happy, elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was in ecstasy. I watched almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding, when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more, and his eyes appeared unhinged, still clutching the knife. He began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed loudly in pain as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me and ran to George and Kate. "No more screaming," George pleaded. No more screaming. I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair in an effort to calm him down. Kate, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained, listening intently. Is he inside the house? I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself on the glass and had retreated, or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally, I heard it. The subtle, but unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside the house, and by the sound of it, was trying to be quiet. I silently guided George and Kate into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then I realized that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well in the bathroom down the hall, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand, or maybe it was the hutch. He's here. The man shrieked hysterically. How dare you hide from him? To this day, I don't know who he was talking about, but it was at that moment, the moment I heard him begin to descend the stairs, that I made my move. Holding Kate in one arm and guiding George with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, stood on the toilet, and placed Kate gently in the shallow window well. Then, I stepped off and told George to get on. "Yucky, gross, no standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think to get George to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "George, get on the toilet now." I snarled at him, the first time I had ever done that. He began to wail in pain and surprise, but he did step onto the toilet at the same time. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once, he almost slipped back down, almost, but he was stronger than I thought he was and managed to pull himself back up. With both of my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man muffled through the pane of glass. "Why are you hiding from him?" "Cold," screamed George as I led him barefoot through the snowy grass. In panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Kate were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as possible. I heard a distant crash from inside the house, and I quickened our pace. Feet numb, I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk and practically had to drag George onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving, and he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks and not even comprehending it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were heading toward. All I knew is what we were heading away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Kate's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I needed to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and saw a light off in the distance. The Garland's house. I'd said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Garland my entire life, but that was our one option. It was in their house that we would seek refuge. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I did not let up the pace until George tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey," he screamed indignantly, looking back at his stumbling block. In the glow of the distant streetlight, I could see George had fallen into blood. A dead man lay face up and eyes open on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him and he had been mostly invisible until George's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I had seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pled, wrenching my eyes away from the grisly scene as I pulled George to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds maybe and finally reached the Garland's front door. The window into their parlor was open and a fire was roaring. Mr. and Mrs. Garland sat drinking tea in cozy armchairs. I pounded ferociously on their door. They answered together, utter bewilderment stamped on their faces. I handed Kate to Mrs. Garland and collapsed into tears. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later and apprehended the man, unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Kate's room, and his intestines partially protruding from the wound on his gut. He had slipped in his attempts to climb where we had climbed, hit his head, and knocked himself out. Apparently, he confessed under questioning that he was a member of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone can tell, does not exist. He claimed to have been taking part in a ritual which required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and my autistic brother had been his target that night. My parents have not shared with me all the details of what happened after that night, but as far as I know, our intruder is currently rotting in his cell. The man he killed, the man lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife on the phone not long before he died, informing her of a suspicious man dressed in black stalking around the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarmed around the block and their home, a crime scene. My father relocated at work and we had moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. Kate is now a bratty middle schooler. As far as I'm concerned, she's perfect. George, now 21, hasn't changed a bit, but he loses his mind if someone knocks on a window. As for me, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie now. I climb mountains with narrow trails and steep ridges. I go cave diving in places where you shouldn't. All, I think, in an attempt to recreate the fearful intensity of that one snowy night long ago. But it never works. The closest I come is when I'm alone, in my room, in the dead of night, when I'm reading your worst stories about your worst times and the things that chase you in your dreams. Then, and then alone, is when the real fear sets in. Story 6. I really love Craigslist. I'd estimate I've met maybe 300 people for buying and selling stuff, and for the most part, everyone was nice and harmless. However, I did run into 2 creeps who made me rethink meeting strangers alone to sell stuff. For your information, I was an early 20s female at the time. First guy. It's 2009. I'm staying with my parents for Christmas holidays in a small town in Florida. I'm going through my childhood room and cleaning out the closet to find a giant CD holder full of maybe 100 really shitty CD. I think Nickelback, Aqua and all that sort of stuff. It's the 21st century. No one uses CD anymore. I figure I'd try and sell the CD on Craigslist. I put up a listing, 100 CD from the late 90s and early to mid 2000s. Mix of pop and rock, all for $35. The next day, I get an email from a guy named John around 2 p.m. He said that he's in town temporarily and that he wants the CD. He says he can pick them up after dinner around 8 p.m. I email him back my address and number and tell him to text or call whenever he's on the way. 8 p.m. comes and goes. I figure I've been stood up, which happens often on Craigslist. No big deal. My dad works for a liquor company and would often do demonstration nights at restaurants and bars and would come home at a bar closing time. This night, he gets home around 3 a.m. I'm in college and a total night owl, so I'm still up probably eating junk food, surfing the web and watching horror flicks. I hear a car pull up, look out the window, and I don't see him sitting in his car eating food. He often stops at Taco Bell on his way home and eats it in the car, so my mom doesn't know he's cheating on his diet. Maybe 10 minutes later, my dad comes in and shouts my name. "Someone is here to see you." Can you please tell me why there's a strange man showing up at our house at 3 a.m.? Huh? I go downstairs and my dad says some guy pulled up in the driveway and asked for me by name. I walk outside with my dad and this guy who's maybe mid-30s gets out of his car. He says he's the Craigslist guy who wanted to buy my CD. My dad goes back in the house. I tell the guy it's really late to be stopping by, especially without texting first. However, since I'm awake, I go grab the CD. He then proceeds to drone on about why he's buying the CD. He says he's engaged to a woman who he loves very much and all he wants to do is make her happy. He said that last week someone broke into her car and stole all her CD. She was really upset, and he wanted a bunch of CDs she used to have. Weird thing is, I didn't list any artists or bands because I was lazy, but I didn't think much about that at the time. Anyway, he said he was getting it for her for a Christmas surprise. He said he was staying with his future in-laws somewhere nearby and their family barbecue ran really late, which is why he never made it at 8 p.m. At this point, I've lost interest and say something along the lines of, "That's sweet. Next time you should probably call or text either the Craigslist guy instead of just showing up." I hand him the CD. He hands me cash and I go back inside. 3 days later, I start getting texts from an unknown number. "Hey, I don't know my way around this town. Care to tour guide? I could really use a massage. Where can I get a massage in this town? You're Asian, do you massage? Would you take $40 for 1 hour? Happy ending." Me, finally texting back. "Who the fuck is this?" Him, "Oh sorry, I bought the CD from you the other day. Do you squirt?" I didn't respond obviously. I show my friends that night and we laugh it off. Then the next day, I get more texts. "I still have your address. I'm at the Bank of America near your neighborhood. I just got $40, babe. Only 3 minutes away. Are you home? Why are you ignoring me? I'm almost here." I immediately run downstairs to tell my dad and mom. It was nighttime, so we shut off all the lights outside and inside my house. My mom, little brother, and I went in my parents' room in the back of the house. My dad hid behind the curtains of the front bay window with a shovel in his hand. A few minutes later, I heard him run down the front hallway, fling the front door open and run outside. We heard some faint shouting, so we all walked out of the bedroom. By that time, my dad came back in with a shovel. His face red and his hair all messed up. Apparently, the guy came driving down our street really slow. My dad recognized the car and went running outside with the shovel, yelling obscenities at the guy. The guy peeled off and never came back or texted me again. So here's my story about the second guy. I was moving from Florida to DC and was going to load up my car as much as I could with stuff. However, I lived on the 3rd floor plus a bit of a walk from my assigned parking lot, so I figured I could use some help. I posted an ad on Craigslist gigs. I said I was looking for someone to help me load some heavy items like TV, desks, etc. in my car. Less than an hour's worth of work and I'd pay $45 or whatever. I give the very first responder my number and address and he shows up. He was probably 5'8", 350 pounds of pure fat. The sweat and smell coming off this guy in the Florida heat was pretty noisy, but I didn't care as long as he did the job right. While he was carting heavy stuff, I was loading lighter things. Whenever I'd go upstairs to grab another load, he'd hurry after me so he could walk up the stairs behind me. I had the door propped open so he didn't have to worry about me needing to unlock the door first or anything. When he'd follow me up the stairs, he'd make these weird grunting noises, like MMMM, and I'd assume it was because he was out of shape. Eventually, he's loaded everything properly, save for some sweat smears on my stuff. I pay him and he drives off. I go back and finish loading and cleaning. I go out maybe 45 minutes later to put another load in my car and I see his truck is back, miles across the street from mine. He's sitting in the driver's seat looking at me. When he sees me notice him, he looks away. I walk over to his window and knock. He rolls it down, and I ask if he needs any help or if he was lost. I was really confused as to why he'd come back, and I knew he didn't live near me. He didn't say anything. He just rolled his window back up and drove off. Okay, whatever. Of course, 5 minutes later, my phone starts blowing up. I didn't recognize the number, so I didn't answer the calls. Then texts start rolling in. Him, I bet you taste salty and sweet. Me, who's this? Him, you know what? Him, what are you up to tonight? Can I come back over? I get this sinking feeling it's the craziest guy. He had never called me about the job when I gave him the number, so I didn't know what his number was. Him, I like your pink panties. I then realize he was looking up my dress when I was walking up the stairs. I immediately feel like a total idiot for wearing a dress that day. He then started dialing my number over and over again. I didn't know how to do the block number thing through Sprint, so I just had to turn my phone off. Later, I was with my guy friend grabbing a bite and turned my phone back on. I got another text from the guy about how he wanted to toss me around like a rag doll and tie me up and make me beg for it. I showed the text to my friend and tell him the story. The crazeless creep proceeds and then start blowing up my phone again. So my friend answers and said he's going to cut his knob off and feed it to the dog if he ever contacts me again. I moved the next day, so I never had to worry about him randomly showing up in his truck again. Since then, I've bought and sold stuff on Craigslist, but I've always made people meet me at a public place before. I've also stalked people's email addresses, Google Plus accounts, etc. Story 7. I worked as a Walmart cashier for a little over a year. I quit in August of 2015 when I went away to college. As a cashier, you see a lot of people in a day, especially at Walmart. And after a while, you don't even see people's faces when you look at them. But there are some people that you see so often that you start to recognize them and sometimes learn their names. There was this one guy, always in the same Green Bay Packers hoodie and Chicago Cubs baseball cap, that would often seek out my line no matter how long it was, just so he could stare at me and rarely say a word. Whenever he did say anything to me, he would always lean across the register to get a close look at my face. He always gave me a really bad vibe, but when I asked other cashiers about him, they said he had never been weird around them. One of the girls even said that he was a close family friend. After that, I dropped the issue. One night, after I'd been working there about a year, I was working a 2-11 shift. Those shifts were always the worst because you would be there for 3, sometimes 4 front-end managers, but also because it takes the chunk out of your day where you can't actually do anything. So I'm down at the self-checkout. It's 10:15, so I'm counting down the minutes until I can shut it down at 10:11. The creepy guy comes in the front door and makes a beeline for me at self-checkout. When I see him come in, I instantly get nervous. He walks up and says, Can I still buy a phone in Card Electronics? I told him I only worked as a cashier on the front end, so I didn't know anything about electronics, but he could go back and check. He seemed peeved by this answer, but he walks away without another word. About 10 minutes later, he comes up with a prepaid phone card and says there's no one at the register in electronics, so I activate his card and hand it to him, telling him have a good night. But he pushes the card back at me without saying a word, and I say, "Is there something wrong?" To which he replies, "These 10 minutes aren't on my phone yet, are they?" I was confused by this statement because of course they weren't. He had just brought the card. I shook my head and he waved his card in front of my face. "Why on earth are you just standing there? Reactivate my phone." When he talked, he was so close I could smell his breath. I was so scared. I wanted to put a call into the CSM so that someone would come down and help me. This is where I should mention that I'm about 5'3" tall, and he is closer to 6'5" probably. He's very stocky and was towering over me, and the thought that he could easily overpower me crossed my mind. But I get so nervous whenever men yell or cuss at me because my dad was never the type to yell or cuss. I took the card out of his hand and he slammed the cell phone on the scanner. I was trying not to let him know I was nervous, but I was terrified. I knew that I had never put minutes on a prepaid phone before, but I don't dare tell him that in fear of what he might do. So, I read the directions, pick up his phone, dial the number, and as I'm putting in the card number, his phone runs out of minutes. I try to call back and get an error message. I'm at a loss. I meekly hand him the phone back and say, "Sorry, something went wrong. I don't know what's happening." As soon as I say it, he takes his phone, opens it up and tries to dial someone, and when it doesn't work, he looks at me with furious eyes. He screams, "What on earth did you do to my phone? What the hell?" His voice is echoing in the store, and unfortunately, we haven't got to the end of second shift rush yet, so there is no one around. He closes his phone and opens it again, trying to make another call, but it doesn't work. He throws the phone down on the scanner again. He says, "I don't know what you did to my phone, but you better fix it." But this comes much more quietly, tragically a whisper. At this point, I'm worried he's going to put his hands on me, and I don't know what to do. I put in a call for the CSM from my register and say, "I've called someone that might be able to help, but we're at a shift change right now, so it might be faster to take it to the customer service desk." He picks up his phone off the podium, still mumbling under his breath that I messed up his phone, and I'm hoping that I can get out of there before he comes back, or at least have someone else down at the self-check with me. Another 15 minutes go by, and I don't see him again. As I'm picking up items that people left at the registers, getting ready to shut them down for the night, he comes back and stands by the podium. He still looks completely annoyed, and my stomach sank. He made that finger motion that means come here without saying anything, and for some reason, that makes me even more nervous. When I'm standing in front of him, he leans so close to my face, I think he's about to kiss me, or bite me, or God knows what. I try to take a step back, but he takes a step forward when I do. A creepy grin comes across his face, and he says, "The guy up there fixed it. Simple fix. But next time, I expect you to know what to do. Understand?" I nod because I don't think I can speak. He gets impossibly closer, before saying, "I'm sorry I raised my voice. I should never have done that. Especially to a pretty girl like you. When he had the last part, he lightly used his finger to brush my bangs to the side. I took a step back, and he said, "Let me make it up to you. Let me buy you a drink." I shake my head and say, "No thank you, I'm only 19. He says, "Shall we get a couple of beers and go back to my place?" Again, I shake my head. "No, really, it's okay. I'm not much of a drinker. I have an early morning tomorrow." He looks displeased with this answer and says, "Tell you what, I'll wait over here by the door just in case you change your mind." I smile at him weakly and tell him to have a good night. When I see him walk through the security things, I quickly shut down the registers and sign off mine. I then run over to the CSM to tell them the whole thing. The third shift CSM that I tell looks at me like I'm lying, and when I finish says, "I know him. He wouldn't hurt a fly. He doesn't have it in him. He's just being dramatic." She then turns to another, older cashier behind her, shakes her head and mumbles, "Teenagers." I'm asked if I can have someone walk me to my car, and they tell me that management is in a meeting and the security guy went home already. So I clocked out and went to the bathroom. I waited in the bathroom for about 10 minutes before coming out and attempting to go to my car. When I walked around the corner through the security things, he wasn't sitting on the bench right there, like I had been expecting. I relaxed a little before I realized he was standing just outside the door, far enough away to keep it from closing, smoking a cigarette. He had turned his back to the door though. Luckily, I never went out of the front doors. I always went down the corridor and out the side door. Quietly I closed the door behind me, so maybe I wouldn't catch his attention. I rushed to my car, which was, fortunately, very close to the building. As I'm quickly walking to my car, I hear him shout, "Hey, why are you avoiding me? Come here." At this point, I take off in a full sprint, which is not easy because I'm wearing sparrows, so it's like running in clogs. I get to my car, get in, lock the doors as I'm starting it, and don't even bubble with my seatbelt. By that point, he had made it almost all the way to my car and was still yelling, telling me he just wanted to talk. I took off as fast as I could and took the longest way home, which had the most turns and twists that I could. When I got home, I told my dad about the experience, and he was so angry that no one answered my calls, or believe me, that he called the store manager the next day and complained. I was never contacted about his complaint, but from that night on, whenever I saw the guy, I would run to the bathroom, or if I couldn't get away, I would put out my lane close sign and turn off the light so he couldn't get in my lane. You always hear people talking about the people of Walmart as being trashy, but they never tell you the select few who are scary as hell. Story 8. These are some strange experiences from a camping trip in northern Ontario I went on back when I was a little kid with my mom and dad. I want to preface this by saying that despite the things I've written about, it was still a good experience. My parents split amicably when I was very young, and I didn't actually live with my dad. I still got to see him though, and these kinds of trips were a bonding experience, and were always pretty fun. I just don't want this story to overshadow that. Alright, so on to the story. My dad and stepmom rented a tiny cabin in northern Ontario one summer through a family friend. I don't know exactly where it was, but I'm certain it was well north of Midland, the regular cottage country for Toronto folks. The cabin was on a lake, and the owner ferried us there on a tiny motorboat. This wasn't an island, mind you. I think there just weren't any roads to access it. Some strange things happened on this trip, and while there isn't a single cohesive timeline here, and I'm not an experienced writer. I'll try my best to document them. I've itemized specific events to make it clear. The owner had just left the canoe at the cabin, and we took it out on a lot of trips on the lake, usually later in the day. I was obsessed with frogs and fish and wildlife as a kid, and this lake was loaded with marshes, so I loved these outings. I remember one of them in particular. It was almost sunset, and we were hiking heading back through one of the marshes, and I heard a faint humming similar to a transformer coming from the tree line on the shore. My dad and stepmom noticed it too, as it grew louder. It stopped all of a sudden a few moments later, but so did everything else. The sounds of birds, frogs croaking, and any other wildlife had completely dropped off and stayed silent. Nothing else strange happened on our way back, but it was creepy as hell. The cabin was on a shoreline, but there wasn't a beach or anything close to one. It was actually a very steep and rocky shore around the entire area, but once you got in the water, there was sand. Mussels and crayfish thrived here, and my dad got the idea to catch some for cooking. Freshwater mussels taste terrible, by the way. Don't try it. My dad isn't a woodsman by any means, but he is a very crafty and resourceful guy. We canoed to a sandy area close to the shore, and we waded out to catch mussels. On both sides of the water here, the shore was very steep rocks, like 2 floors up with thick forests at the top. At some point during our escapade, I caught a glimpse of something among the trees on the opposite shore. I couldn't make it out very well, but it was white, almost like the texture of a birch, and very lanky. I remember thinking that it definitely was a person, but it was too far from the general shape of one. It was staggering around, lethargically and slowly. If it was an animal, then something was definitely wrong with it. I waded over to my dad and told him to look up there, and by that point it was gone. Because of this, I'm still not 100% sure that it isn't something I imagined. I was 9 or 10 at the time, but I remember seeing it again on the opposite shore on our way back. This one I don't actually remember. Instead, my dad told me about it. On one of our canoeing outings, my dad and my stepmom decided to visit the little peninsula on the other side of the lake close to the marshes area. We all got there and dragged the canoe onto the little shoreline there was, and walked inland single file. There wasn't a path, but the trees weren't particularly dense either, enough to see water when you look back. Pretty soon I noticed that the entire place was covered in mushrooms, and live trees had given way to downed and dead trees further inland. This was unusual, because it didn't look like there had been a forest fire or anything like that. They were just dead. It also started to smell really, really bad. Not wanting to endanger us by going further, we all turned back. He didn't want to let on that he was nervous because I was young at the time, but he told me that he was seriously freaked out. We stayed clear of that for the rest of the trip. This is something that my dad told me that happened to him during this trip a couple of years ago. He went hiking by himself at some point, and when he was deeper into the woods, everything around him just stopped. No sound whatsoever, no movement, no wind or leaves falling. It all returned a minute later, and nothing else eventful happened for the rest of his hike. This one isn't really scary as much as it is weird, I guess. We spent most nights having fires outside, and one night my dad and I stayed up watching X-Files on this tiny black TV. I'm not actually sure how this place even had power, since it wasn't accessible by road, but maybe it had a generator or even a small PV battery setup for all I know. There wasn't much other than a couple of lights, that TV, and a small water pump to the lake. Anyway, I was young and X-Files was creepy as hell to me. During one of the episodes, we both heard that humming coming from outside, like when we were on the canoe. It was faint, but definitely there. We went outside with a flashlight to see if we could identify it, but we couldn't see anything. We didn't want to go into the woods this late or take the canoe out, and it sounded like it was far away enough, so we just went back inside. It was intermittent throughout the rest of the night, sometimes getting louder, sometimes quieting down. In the morning, our water wasn't working. My dad went to investigate, and apparently the power pump cabling had been messed with. It was an easy fix, but strange nonetheless. This was probably the most unsettling one that I remember. I'd wake up earlier than everyone else in the morning, because I was pretty hyped to go out and catch toads, frogs, and whatever else I could find. I even set a trap for a chipmunk one time, and successfully caught it. I remember one morning, I had just woken up before sunrise and was still in bed. In the window adjacent to my bed, I saw something that usually wasn't there. It was half a face poking around the edge of a window and staring into our cabin, sickly pale orange with giant black holes where the eyes were supposed to be. This thing was definitely not human. I freaked out and hid under the covers, and eventually fell back asleep. When I woke up again, everyone was also awake, and there was no sign of anything there. I always thought of this particular experience as something that I just imagined after just waking up. It had to be. About a month ago, I met up with my dad while visiting my home city, and we were talking about this trip a bit again. He mentioned that there were quite a few times he felt uneasy on the trip. For example, my dad usually goes jogging early in the morning for exercise, and it's a habit he still keeps up to this day. He decided to abstain a couple of mornings at the cabin though, because he felt there was something he just couldn't place that was creeping him the hell out. I connected this one with a window incident after our conversation, but when I did it, it really made me think about this entire trip, and is one reason I decided to write a post about it. I can't undeniably prove any of what's happened, but for what it's worth, you can look through my post history and see that I don't tell these stories regularly. I'm going to end this here now, because it's gotten a lot longer than I expected, and it's all pretty disjointed. I was a little kid at the time, and these things happened, and I don't remember everything, or even the order of the events. I'm certain that my dad and stepmom experienced stuff themselves, but I didn't think to ask last time I saw, because I simply wasn't thinking about the entire trip that deeply. Story 9. As a third-year university student, I'd like to think that pizza, gyros, and hamburgers are important staples of my cost-effective, and not really nutritious nutritional needs. Needless to say, it wasn't long before I became besties with the guys running the local pizza parlor 3 blocks from my house. These guys were super cool. I met them for the first time when my best friend Sharon, and I went to buy pizza for our movie night. I wasn't too jazzed on the movie night, because my lesbianist roommate Sam insisted on joining in. Now, I'm not homophobic. John is the biggest lesbian out there. She thinks I have a very nice butt, but I was Samophobic though. She pretty much decided early on that I was hiding my true lesbian nature, and had been trying to get me to accept myself for what she believed me to be for like 3 months. This meant that movie nights with Sam mostly consisted of that one where Cuba Gooding goes on a gay cruise, that one with the chick working in a flower shop. So, I wasn't too stoked on the movie night. These mostly ended in deep conversations about the importance of revealing the true sexuality, and neither was Sean, because Sam had a way of making things really awkward. I told these pizza dudes about my roommate and her crazy movie antics, and they tried to help us out by inviting Shah and I to come back at midnight to watch a horror movie on the projector that they had set up in the dining area. I'm pretty big on horror movies, so to me it sounded like an awesome idea. Shah thought it sounded like a plot to kidnap and murder us. We were going though. Over the next couple of months, I became really tight with the guys, and I would come over every Friday night for a scary movie night and discounted pizza. The dudes were cool and a good way to get time away from Sam, who had taken to tracking my movements like Dr. Bounty Hunter. The guys were pretty successful with their pizza, and pretty soon they'd have to hire more drivers, which is when I met Bill. Bill is pretty much your stereotypical old guy who failed at life. He was in his 40s, but he looked like he was pushing 60. He was constantly high and never showed up to work on time, but always had a really measly and long-winded excuse full of anecdotes of why his life as a pizza delivery guy was so hard. Customers hated him too. When they opened their front door, he would push his way into the house and put their pizza on the kitchen counter or table, something he thought would get him a bigger tip. He wouldn't leave their front door until they gave him what he felt was a big enough tip. If they didn't have money, then he'd tell them that they could tip him in the pot. If they didn't have that, then he'd start to yell at them for being cheap assholes. One night I was studying and had to order, and instead of going out, normally the guys only sent the call delivery guys to my place, but that night rotation hit Bill. He stood in my doorway, chatting me up for a long time, and told me that the guys called him Big Bill for a reason. So obviously, Bill needed to get fired like yesterday. The guys do what they have to do and give him notice. I come into the shop on Bill's last working night and talk to my buddy Pete about the firing. Apparently Bill was taking it really well and was just about to finish his last delivery of the night. I hung around to talk to Pete about his troubles with his crazy girlfriend. Actually, she was a pretty nice lady. Bill comes in while we're talking and tries to join in the conversation. I was standing at the counter with Pete behind Bill at my side. Bill starts offering me rides home. I decline, but hey, dude gives me the skeebies. He kept insisting that it was on his way, but I just kept telling him that it was only like a 15-minute walk, and that I'd be fine. He started to get pouty, and then said that I didn't want to get in the car with him because I thought he was creepy. He hit the nail on the head. But since this is Canada, and we're polite to a fault, I just laughed it off, and insisted that I'd really rather not. Bill kept pouting, and then went outside to have a smoke in his car. On his way out, he grabbed my ass. This sort of abuse isn't uncommon for my bum, but it still pisses me the hell off when it happens. As soon as Bill was out the door, and halfway to his car, I told Pete about the ass grab. Pete was a total dude about it, and told me that it was a good ass, and that he'd probably done the same if he had the balls. I was pissed as a wet cat, and it was getting late, so I started to trudge back home. At the cross light, a gray piece of junk that I recognized as Bill's car drove up to me. Bill rolled down his window and asked if I was sure that I didn't want a ride. Even after his charming ass grab, I was still pretty keen on not getting in the car with him. So once again I said, "No thanks, dude," and he pulled the right, presumably to loop back into the back parking lot of the shop. He shot me a smile and a creepy little wave. I hated that dude. I kept on walking until I reached the next crosswalk. When I was halfway across, a gray little shitbeater drove up behind me and blasted on the horn. The car drove past me, so I figured it was just Bill being an aggressive dick like usual. I walked down my main street keeping an eye out for him, until I reached the gate, leading from the street to the backyard of my house. I'm usually pretty nervous entering the backyard, because it's dark as the bottom of the ocean in that bitch. So I grabbed my keys between my fingers for a makeshift pair of brass knuckles for a just in case. All was good in the backyard, but when I turned the corner to reach the front of the house, I saw a gray shitty beater parked in the curb. One thought went through my head. Crap. So I'm not super rational, and even though I was standing right at the entrance to my landlord's basement suite, I instead bolted for an extra 20 feet to my front door. I felt like I was going a million miles an hour, and that he was going at like 0.3 miles pace per minute. I reached the door and fumbled for my keys, when I heard the car door shut. I dropped my keys on the ground. I whipped down to pick them up, and I heard him whistle. I jammed the keys into my door, turned around, and slammed that shut behind me as fast as I could, and turned the lock. Suddenly, my life got really quiet. I didn't turn on any of the lights. I just went to the front window and watched. I couldn't make out Bill. I could see that he was in his car, from the lit end of his cigarette. I called Sam, but she wasn't home, so instead, I called Pete on the phone. Our conversations basically went like this. I hung up on Pete, and moved away from the front big window, so that I could hide in my room, where I could look through the smaller window that he was less likely to see me in. All of our doors are locked, and are really heavy duty, so I feel pretty secure in my own room. I didn't turn on my bedroom lights, but I crumpled once I locked the door. I sat there for a little bit, trying to calm myself down by breathing. I heard my landlord watching a movie downstairs in his living room, but I didn't get up until I heard the doorbell. The only way to reach the door to the downstairs suite was to walk down the stairs, leading to the front door, and then take the next set of stairs down. I was fucking determined to get my landlord, a way bigger guy than Pete, but I needed to get past our windowed front door first, where Bill would be able to see me if I was at the door. At this point, I was pretty scared, and being scared makes me angry, so I essentially said, "Fuck it," to myself, and went down the stairs to the front door. I could see his head, and the left half of his body, through the window panel. He saw me trying to sneak past, and called out, "Hey, what? It's me, Bill, from generic Italian mob boss pizza. Pete sent me over with a free pizza for you." I knocked myself right down the stairs to my landlord's door. I knocked, and he grugly opened it for me. I told him the situation, which basically went down like this. "Landlord, creepy pizza guy followed me home, and now he won't leave. My landlord is pretty much the coolest dude ever, so he snaps awake and heads up to the front door. He uses his adult voice, and tells Bill that what did not order pizza, and that if he doesn't leave, he's going to call the police. Bill doesn't say anything, but we see him walk back to his car. He actually did have a pizza box, but probably one meant for another dude. My landlord was tired, so he gave me a quick, "Come get me immediately when crazy shit like this happens," and then went to bed. I watched Bill in his car, from the big window, keeping my screen on, and lit as bright as it could go, so that he could see that I had my phone ready to dial. He started up his car, and rolled down the road. I called Pete at the pizza place to tell him that my landlord handled it, and that he didn't have to come anymore. Pete waited for Bill to come back, and then told him to never come back to the pizza place, or near me again. It's been almost 2 years since then, and I never heard from, or heard about Bill since then. In the end, I didn't call the cops, Which, if you read my post about the tomboy and the mountain goats, you'd know that that's the kind of way I was raised. I don't know if there's a cultural difference between Canadians and Americans, but I only once have I called the cops in my life, when I was too young to deal with the situation myself. Story 10. In 2006, I was a college student at ASU. I lived in an off-campus apartment on the ground floor, and it was a block off a major street here in Phoenix, called Baseline. These details are important. In the summer of 2006, Phoenix, Arizona was plagued by 2 serial killers. One was a Phoenix shooter, who ended up being a team of 2 guys randomly shooting people, and the other was a Baseline killer, a rapist and murderer. Having 2 serial killers put the entire city on edge, and everyone was talking about it. I even saw articles in Time or the Newsweek about the situation. So the fall 2006 semester had just started. Now, you may have heard this, but Phoenix is hot in August. It would get stuffy in my apartment, and so I'd leave the car window cracked a little because the morning air is nice. The blinds provided visual cover. Anyway, one morning, a strange sound woke me up. It was the crack of dawn at 4:45 am, and the sun was just barely coming up. The sound was a tapping sound, and it seemed intentional, but I thought it could be a bird or some branches or something trivial. I ignored it, and it went away for a bit. After about 90 seconds of silence, the tapping returned, and it was absolutely purposeful. In my mind, I thought it was my boyfriend, who thought it was cute to try and scare me sometimes. I decided I'd be a bit of a brat and make him wait, but I was also getting really angry. How dare he pull a prank when I'm trying to sleep? This is just like him. I'm going to give him a piece of my mind without disturbing my sleep like this. The tapping continued. At a certain point, I get up to get a glass of water. Still being in the mindset of wanting to annoy my stupid boyfriend, he thought this would be funny. I saw some movement through the slit in the blinds. I marched over and yanked the blinds so I could see. Definitely not my boyfriend. I said very loudly, "What the fuck?" He sort of seemed taken aback by my anger, but only slightly. The man I saw would be with me forever, or more specifically, his eyes and the feeling they gave me were insanely creepy. Honestly, words can't do justice to how terrifying his eyes were. They looked like black orbs with no white in them. Absolutely predatory. When I see pictures of Ted Bundy or Charles Manson, that's exactly what he looked like. Even if you saw a picture of how they looked, it's different when you experience it in person. He was crouched down like an umpire. He had dark pants, a dark purple shirt, and a dark nightgown. He had dark skin. I thought he was Hispanic, but I later found out he was a light-skinned black guy. You'll know how I learned his name later. Anyway, after I yelled, "What the fuck" at him, he whispers to me, "Can I talk to you?" If you want to know how insanely creepy that is to hear, just whisper that sentence aloud to yourself right now. It sends chills down my spine when I think about how it sounded. His hand subtly moved towards his waist. I later learned that he would blitz attack his victims, and he probably had a gun. Now, this is about a 3-second interaction at this point. For some reason, I thought of Ted Bundy and how he pretended to be crippled to target his victims. I thought of my mom telling me to not be nice to strangers, don't be afraid to be a bitch. My thinking wasn't as calculated as all that, but it was more of the nano-processing of how I was dealing with the situation. So when he whispered that, I started yelling at him, "Hell no, get the fuck out of here, douchebag." I shut the window angrily and locked it. I lay back down and wondered if I'd been too mean. What if he needed help? But then, why would he be tapping and whispering if he was in trouble? He's probably a creep after all. I was too annoyed to get back to sleep, but I sort of laid back down. I told my roommate about it about an hour later, and she sort of jokingly asked if it could have been the baseline killer. When she said that, my heart sank. His face looked exactly like it did in the police sketches that were on the billboards everywhere. The only problem is that those billboards showed him with dreads. The man at my window had no dreads. Apparently, he was some sort of disguise artist who'd wear wigs. Updating the police sketch would have been a nice move, but they didn't. I called the Phoenix police, and the detective I talked to agreed that it sounded like his MO. The suspect would say something to throw off his target, and then he'd blitz attack. The detective said that my angry response probably made me seem like too much of a hassle, and moved on. The only problem with that, I thought the guy looked Hispanic, and the detective said many witnesses described him as black. I thought they might want to come out and try samples or surveillance video or something, but I didn't hear back from the detective. My parents freaked out. They got us knives, pepper spray, and put up signs. We tried to leave the apartment complex, and we learned another tenant had complained about the exact same thing. I never learned the details, but this idiot was apparently going around the damn complex trying to find a target. The stupid apartment wouldn't let us out of our lease, so we moved to a second-floor apartment right above our old unit. Side note, the neighbors who moved into our old unit were horrible, obnoxious tweakers who would do meth, play pitbull on repeat for hours, and have knife fights at 11 a.m. on weekdays. There were times I wondered if they might be worse than the actual serial killer who came to my window, so that unit was cursed somehow. Anyway, on the 4th of September 2006, they arrested Mark Gadu. I think the detective didn't call me back because they were days away from arresting Gadu. When I saw his mugshot, I was sick but also relieved. He was absolutely the guy outside my window. To me, he looked like he could be Hispanic. You can judge for yourself if you Google it. He's on death row in Arizona now. His wife tried to announce some campaign to show how the police were framing him or something. On a personal level, it certainly would make for an interesting coincidence if the framed innocent guy was also whispering like a creep and tapping my window. The other cool thing about this story is that I had a really bad eating disorder at the time, and about 8 months after this happened, I got in solid recovery. I never would have experienced how wonderful life could be if the slightest thing would have changed that morning in 2006. I can't think of something more scarier than a serial killer tapping your window. That actually happened to me, and if it happens to you, just scare them right back. Don't be afraid to be downright rude to someone who's injecting themselves into your space. It could save your life if you're not afraid to throw your weight around and tell someone off. Story 11. During some cave exploring, my family and some friends were in some deep caves, and we were heading out. We found a slit about knee-high in the rock. Getting on your stomach, there was a tight squeeze you could get into, and it led to a small crawl space in the rock, with crawls growing on the ceiling, making beautiful crystal ceiling displays. We went in one by one, and if you were claustrophobic, this place was your worst nightmare. Most times you could feel the ceiling on your back, and the floor on your stomach every time you took a breath. We went deep in, and it was just incredible, like a small wall tucked away within solid rock. I had made it as deep as I could go, before the path wound to the left, and covered with stalagmites and stalactites of sediment. Everyone was having a grand time, and we started feeling some trickles of water on our backs. It turns out it was raining outside, and with the way the crawl space dipped down before flattening out, the whole place would fill up with rainwater pretty damn quickly, with the only way for it to drown out was the way we came in. It started as trickles, before it went into streams and began to pool up. Being the furthest away from the exit, and you can only just crawl flat on your stomach, with jagged crystal pointing down from the ceiling, I started to panic a bit. Everyone crawled out as fast as they could, as the water kept coming in. The streams grew larger and larger. We left one at a time as fast as we could, but it wasn't fast enough. I could feel the water coming on my chin as I crawled behind my brother. Each inch I took forward felt so painfully slow that I could feel the walls compress around me, and the water was unrelenting, now splashing against my panic squirms. I got out just as the water was up to my lips, and everyone got out safely. I'm not eager to try that again. Thank you for listening, and I wish you good health. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you very much.